Prior to the 18th century, it was believed that mental illnesses had supernatural causes. Dark magic, spirits, demons, the work of the devil, that kind of thing. In ancient Mesopotamia, it was believed that if you suffered from a disease or mental illness, it was caused by a specific deity. In ancient Egypt, they believed that some illnesses were caused by forces of demonic origin, and used spells and incantations to ward them off. They were also believed to have used temples as retreats for people suffering from these ailments. Similarly, throughout Europe it was believed that mental illnesses were of a spiritual or demonic nature, though some parts of Europe subscribed to humoral theory, which originated in ancient Greece. The belief of humorism was that the human body contained various bodily fluids, or humors, and imbalances of these humors could lead to both physical and psychological problems. From the 18th century onward, asylums were used, places of residence and treatment for those considered mentally ill. They have been used extensively in media and entertainment. Now, however, many of them stand dilapidated and abandoned, yet they still harbor some dark secrets. In the 19th century, if you or your family were rich and you needed to be placed in an asylum, you would be placed in a small, private one. You would be reasonably looked after, at least for the standards of the time. You would have adequate food, rest, and peace. However, if you were lower on the socioeconomic ladder, things for you would be much, much different. Care? No. You would be neglected. A nice warm meal? No. What you were served was barely edible. More often than not, people were admitted to these institutions against their will. Inside, they were greeted with unsanitary conditions and poor treatment from asylum staff. Of course, back then people did not know about mental illnesses as we know about them today, and thus their treatments were, well, less than adequate. It was more akin to a prison than a place of treatment. In the late 19th century, American journalist named Elizabeth Jane Cochran, better known by her pen name Nellie Bly, was asked to pretend to be mentally ill in order to gain access to an asylum by her employer at The World, the newspaper she worked for at the time, so they could investigate and uncover the conditions inside. The asylum in question? The Women's Lunatic Asylum on Roosevelt Island in New York City. Bly had to work at pretending to be insane, at least for the standards of the time, in order to fool the physicians and be admitted. Eventually, it worked. The events that followed could only be described as cruel, apathetic, and dehumanizing. The patients inside had dreary, hopeless expressions, and were treated with callous indifference by staff. Bath time consisted of being forcefully undressed and forced into a tub of freezing cold water that was seldom changed between patients. Dinner time consisted of bland food that was sometimes spoiled. They were unable to talk to each other, lest they be scolded. Patients were given no possessions of their own, and were completely cut off from the rest of the world. Complaints of discomfort from the cold or unsanitary conditions would fall on deaf ears. If patients did not do what they were told, or were uncooperative, they were beaten. Much of the time, patients endured verbal abuse as well. While she was there, Bly talked to numerous patients in the facility and recounted their stories. One of the patients, Mrs. Cotter, a pretty, delicate woman, one day thought she saw her husband coming up the walk. She left the line in which she was marching and ran to meet him. For this, she was sent to the retreat. She afterwards said, "The remembrance of that is enough to make me mad. For crying, the nurses beat me with a broom handle and jumped on me, injuring me internally, so that I shall never get over it. Then they tied my hands and feet and, throwing a sheet over my head, twisted it tightly around my throat, so I could not scream. and thus put me in a bathtub filled with cold water. They held me under until I gave up every hope and became senseless. At other times, they took hold of my ears and beat my head on the floor and against the wall. Then they pulled my hair out by the roots, so it will never grow in again. While I was there, a pretty young girl was brought in. She had been sick and fought against being put in that dirty place. One night, the nurses took her and, after beating her, they held her naked in a cold bath. Then they threw her on her bed. When morning came, the girl was dead. The doctors said she died of convulsions, and that was all that was done about it. Eventually, her employer got her out through a lawyer, and she reported her experiences to the court. Her actions enacted change, and a reform was passed, improving the conditions of the asylum. Bly's recounting of her experience is arguably one of the most detailed. There are other pieces of information scattered throughout the internet, which detail other atrocities committed in these institutions. Not just physical and verbal abuse, but even some accounts of sexual abuse. Patients would be physically restrained with straitjackets and forced into isolation for extended periods of time. Throughout the history of mental illness, there have been many attempts to treat these conditions. More often than not, they would be more harmful than helpful. Manfred Sakel, a doctor from Germany, would employ a treatment dubbed insulin shock therapy. He would inject patients with a dangerously high amount of insulin, forcing them into a coma. After several hours, he would revive them. This would be repeated daily for weeks or even months on end. He believed that it would cure them of their madness. Though, of course, it was questionable in its effectiveness. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a 19th century doctor, is largely considered the father of psychiatry, and he was a large proponent of the idea that mental illnesses were, in fact, of the mind, and not of demonic possession. He instead thought these ailments were brought about because of imbalances in bodily fluids. So, in order to treat patients, he would force them to vomit, blister them, and would also conduct bloodletting. Metrazole shock treatment, introduced by Hungarian psychiatrist Ladislas von Meduna, was another method used to treat mental illnesses, schizophrenia in particular. It involved the injection of metrazole, a powerful central nervous system stimulant. It was believed that the seizures induced by the drug would, quote-unquote, shock the patient's brain out of the condition, though it proved not only to be completely ineffective, but lethal as well, and the treatment was later discontinued in the 1950s. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, was introduced in 1938 by Italian psychiatrists Lucio Bini and Ugo Soletti. It was used to treat people with depression that did not respond well to medications. It involved first giving the patient anesthetic and drugs that relaxed the muscles before applying an electrical current in either one or both of the temples of the head for a fraction of a second. The sudden jolt of electricity would cause the patient to have seizures, much like the metrazole shock treatment mentioned before, though this method of treatment did seem to help some patients. Lobotomies are perhaps the most famous psychiatric treatment mentioned in this video. The procedure involved drilling holes into patients' skulls and severing the connections in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. Other methods of lobotomy included driving an ice pick under the eyelid and against the top of the eye socket, then hammering it with a mallet to break through the bone and access the brain to sever supposedly problematic connections in the brain. The results of these procedures varied widely from patient to patient. Some actually experienced lessened symptoms, others had their entire sense of identity destroyed, and some went into a vegetative state post-operation. Needless to say, they didn't know about neurology like we do today, and the role of the prefrontal cortex in executive function. Thankfully, today these conditions are better understood, with ethical scientific progress being made each year to improve the lives of those suffering from these conditions. Modern, scientific-backed therapeutic methods, medications, and counseling exist today. Are the systems we have in place perfect? No, but they are a far cry better than the questionable methods of the past.